So this is the video that we're going to use for low rate of population growth. And we're going to use Japan as an example of this type of country. So again, we're talking about a low rate of population growth. I'm going to abbreviate population growth. Just if you didn't know, here's a map over on the right side. It shows Japan over here in East Asia near China, but I'm sure most of you probably already know that. So what kind of countries are going to have generally have a low rate of population growth? You're going to find these in developed countries. So as opposed with Ethiopia and high rates of population growth, those were underdeveloped or developing countries. These are developed countries. And so what does that mean? Generally, they're going to have economic wealth. So most of these countries are going to be economically wealthy and have good living conditions. Okay, so low rate of population growth equals probably a developed country with pretty good wealth and good living conditions. So let's go back and do some review from our background video. Let's look at the birth rate. So here Japan is the birth rate from 2000 all the way up to 2014. Just look at those numbers for a few minutes and then see what you notice. So what you should notice is that, again, just like Ethiopia, it's not one single line, but we do have a trend, especially from 2001 all the way to about 2011. It seems like there's a continuous decrease in the birth rate, right? So this general trend direction of a decrease in the birth rate, except for right, this strange last 3 years, 2012 to 2014, right, where the birth rate goes back up to around 8 or at a high of 8.39. Now compare that with Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia in 2014 had a rate of 37.66. So you can see the great difference in the birth rates between Japan and Ethiopia, and you're probably already figuring out why they're having a low rate of population growth. But also, let's compare 2013 was 38.07. So huge difference in the birth rates if you compare with Ethiopia. Let's look at the death rate then. Okay, so take a look at the numbers for a minute and then unpause the video or come back once you've had a look at the numbers. So what you should notice is generally over the course from 2000 to about 2014, these numbers are generally stable, right? Oops, excuse me. So the numbers, the death rate is generally stable. Remember, this is not necessarily how many people are dying, but how many per 1,000 people, right? And notice though also in about 2011 there seems to be this strange peak. It increases from 2007 all the way up to 2011, and then from 2012 it goes back down pretty much. So this would be something interesting. We could look to try and find out what was happening in 2011. Why did that death rate increase? But that would be something that we'd have to do some research on. Again, compare this to Ethiopia. If you compare the death rate to Ethiopia, 2013 and 2014 are relatively similar to the death rate in Ethiopia. So think about what that means comparing Japan's death rate and Ethiopia later in the video. So take a second again. pause the video, and then you're going to figure out what is the rate of natural increase for 2012, 2013, and 2014. When you've done that, come back and I'll give you the answers. So 2012, the rate of natural increase should be a negative 0.07, excuse me, 0, let me erase that. So the rate of natural increase, should be a negative 0.76, 0.76. 2013 should be a negative 1.04. And 2014 should be a negative 1.31. So what does this mean? Any negative you see is that more people are dying than are being replaced by births, right? So right there we see population decrease. More people are dying than are being replaced by births. So look through the numbers, look through the birth rate, look through the death rate, and identify when was the last time that Japan actually had a positive rate of natural increase. And when you find that answer, then you can unpause it. So last year that Japan had a positive, just barely a positive number, right, is about 2006. So let's look at the density. This time, instead of giving you numbers, I'm going to give you a map, right? And so we can look at the density of Japan using this map. Excuse me, let me get my pen up. So what do you notice, right? Red, the redder the color means the more dense, the more blue, darker blue, less dense. So where do you notice a lot of the population? Obviously this you can identify as being Tokyo, the largest city in Japan. Hugely dense area, lots of people, but there are several major dense points along, especially the coast, but also specifically the east coast of Japan. So it looks like most people are gathered or centered around this eastern coast of Japan. So let's start off by looking at the causes. What causes a population to have a low growth rate? Again, we're going to start off a little bit different with Ethiopia. We're going to look at the death rate rather than the birth rate. We'll look at that second. But first first cause of a low rate of population growth is a low death rate. Again, what does this mean? It doesn't mean that people are not dying, right? It's not like people can live forever, but it means that people are living into older ages, right? They're not dying as frequently as early, right? So they're living longer, living into older ages, or a longer life expectancy. So there are basically three main reasons why a population might have a low death rate. First one, we've seen this before, is a higher standard of hygiene. Right? Hygiene again was mentioned in Ethiopia, but with Japan and other countries with low population rates of population growth, hygiene might be much better. So again, notice they're talking about clean food and water and air, all of these things, right? So a clean environment, you could summarize it. So generally, Japan's known for having a clean environment, so this fits, right? But what does this do for people? It means that people are less prone to contracting diseases, less likely to contract or get a disease. And so we talked about that again. If you have fewer diseases over the course of your lifetime, you're going to be stronger and able to live into a longer life. So let's look at some specific evidence for Japan again. Here we see an article that talks about hygiene in Japan, and so their question at the bottom is, so why is Japan so obsessed with hygiene, right? That would be a good question to ask, but really all we're concerned about is knowing that this obsession with hygiene means that people in Japan can live healthier lives, right? And an example of this is that the author uses is the Japanese words for antibacterial materials or degerming things. People are very concerned about germs and using antibacterials in Japan. Also, toilet seats. If you've ever been to Japan and gone to the bathroom, you'll see that the famous electronic toilet seats with the squirting water, which is called a bidet, to clean you. This is seen as better hygiene. They also place disinfectant or antibacterial sprays around the seats to keep things clean. So there's this great obsession with hygiene in Japan. So let's look at the next one, better nutrition, right? The textbook, again, these are the textbook definitions of why you have a low death rate. So here's the textbook definition. When people have more money, they can afford enough food, not only to survive, but thrive, and that food shortages are rare in countries where they have a low death rate. So this makes sense, right? Going back to our definition, usually a country with a low rate of population growth is wealthier, so they have more money, so wealth. I missed the L in that, wealth, but so people are able to afford enough food to not only survive, but then thrive, to live and not go hungry. This could also include have enough money to buy good, nutritious food, right? Not only just enough food, but good, nutritious food that means that you're going to live a healthy life. So the evidence down below is not necessarily related, but we'll talk about what it could mean, right? So if you read it, it talks about the oldest person in the world just passed away in Japan. This person was from Japan, and they passed away at the age of 116, beating the last record holder, which was also from Japan in Osaka, was 115 years old, right? So Japan actually has, the UN has figured this number out, but Japan has the greatest proportion of centenarians in the world, and a centenarian is somebody that is above or over the age of 100. So they have the most people over the age of 100. So how could this be connected to nutrition, right? Well, having a healthy diet, clean, good food, healthy food, could mean that you're going to be able to live into this old age, right? If we didn't have that good food, it's possible that you're not going to be able to live to 100. So the last cause for low death rate is better medical care and health care. Again, compare this with Ethiopia. We brought this up before. But the textbook definition, textbook definition is up here. Better care means longer lives. Mass vaccination movements prevent the spread of disease, right? So mass vaccination, these are the vaccinations that you get to prevent diseases. For example, the flu virus or mumps or measles. You get these vaccinations when you're young. So the two groups that really need these, that are most affected by these mass vaccinations, are babies and the elderly. So old people and babies really are affected by these vaccinations, and it helps prevent deaths from these very easily preventable diseases. So also, what else helps? Well-trained hospitals, doctors means that people can get top care and the best treatments, right? So, right, these are important. What could this mean? It could mean that they have good technology. So hospitals need the best technologies, MRIs, CAT scans to see for problems, but also good medicine. Right? The most advanced medicines that they have. And last but not least, it could also mean good training or well-trained doctors that have good knowledge. So you want a doctor that has the best up-to-date knowledge and training, and so that means that you're probably going to live a little bit longer if he's able to spot diseases and knows the best treatments that are available for you. So let's look at some evidence. Again, compare this to Ethiopia. The physician density, right? So the number of physicians per 1,000 people. In Japan for 2006 and 2008, it's 2.06 and 2.14. Remember what it was in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia in 2006, it was 0.02 doctors per 1,000 people. 2004, it was 0.03. So huge difference. There are many more doctors in Japan compared to the people. So let's look at some specific evidence about Japan. This article below, Japan spends half as much of it on its healthcare as Americans, but they still live longer. And many give this credit to the cheap and universal healthcare system, right? So universal means that it's accessible to all citizens, right? All citizens are covered. So all citizens are covered by the healthcare. So everybody is able to get the help they need when they get sick. I'm not going to pronounce the Japanese name because my Japanese is horrible, but let's move on and notice that they talk about some of the good things about this healthcare. Let's start here. Japanese people see doctors twice as often as people do in Europe, right, as Europeans. And they take more life-prolonging and life-enhancing drugs. So again, top medicine. They have the best medicine available for them. Also, let's look at how they're cared for in hospitals, right? Best training in hospitals. Rather than being pushed out of hospital beds, they stay 3 times as long as the rich world average, right? So people in Japan are spending more time in the hospital bed if they have to go to a hospital in the first place. And so what does this all mean? It talks again about life expectancy. What is the average person expected to live? How long, how many years? 52 years in 1945, right? Compare that to Ethiopia in around the same time, about 1950. I think it was about 40 years. So a little bit longer than that. But today it is 83 years, much greater, right? And it also helps boost mortality rates in infants, or lowers it, excuse me. And Japan has the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. Right? But it's very cheap, notice. It's only 8.5% of their GDP. So they don't spend a lot of money on it, but they get some of the best quality medical care, which means that they're able to keep people alive for a long time. So we've talked about the causes of a low death rate. Now we need to go to the other side and talk about a low birth rate. So first cause for a low birth rate would be later marriages, right? So again, the textbook definition up here says when people marry later, they tend to have fewer children. They have children later in life, and so they have fewer children. If women have more education, they tend to pursue a career before marrying and having children. So this first one, right, can include both men and women. Right? The same thing goes for both men and women. If a man waits later to have children, then he's probably going to have fewer children. Same with a woman. Right? Remember we talked about this with Ethiopia. The longer you have in your lifetime while you're married, more likely that you're going to have more children over that course of that lifetime. So if you are getting married later, you're going to have fewer children. And the same with women. And men, right? The more education you have in a country, the more you're probably going to want to use that education to get more money, right? To be paid back for spending all those years in university and college, especially women. So if they get an education, many times they're going to spend quite a few years pursuing a career rather than settling down possibly and having children. So let's look at some of the evidence. Again, in Japan, just in the 4 past decades, there's been this huge shift, right, in marriage rates. It's dropped by over half, from 12 marriages per 1,000 people in 1972 to 5.7 in 2009. So a big, big drop in the number of the marriages. Notice, right, because people are getting married later, they're going to have their first children later. So I've looked up also some additional information from the CIA World Factbook that you could find this from. So the average age for first-time mothers So this is the average age of the women in the country that are giving birth for the first time, for their first child. For Japan, in 1975, it was 25 years old. So the average age for the first-time mother in Japan in 1975 was 25 years old. Now in 2012, it is 30.3. Right, so 30.3 years old is the average age when most women, or average age for women to have their first child. So much later. Let's compare that with Ethiopia. So the same statistic, average age of the first-time mothers. In Ethiopia, it's 19.6 years old. Now understand that this is an average, and because Ethiopia has some of these young marriages, 15 years old, something like that, that pushes down the average. The mean number is around in the 20s, 20 to 23 years old or something like that. So just understand what the average means. Okay, let's talk about the second cause for a low birth rate would be fewer marriages. So not only later marriages, but fewer marriages, right? So again, as more people choose not to get married, or many people might choose not to get married, or they might, if they do get married, they choose not to have children at all. Right? So there might be less need for a child. Remember, if they're not working on a farm or in the countryside, they might not need as much labor from children. And then there's also less pressure and stress put on people to have children. So society places less of a pressure, less of an importance on having children. Right? And so think about that. Why would children not be as important, right? As governments are becoming wealthier, they can do more to help these older people. As people age, they need, sometimes we said children had to take care of their parents in developing countries or poorer countries like Ethiopia. But here in Japan, the government is wealthy and has good programs to take care of many of these older people. So you might not need a child to look after you when you get older. So they choose not to have one. So let's look at the evidence again. It says the number of Japanese people who will probably never get married is also rising. It's estimated that while the current figure for unmarried men is 16% and 8% for women, so these are people that are choosing not to get married but are of marriageable age, right? This will rise to 29% for men and 22% for women, right, by 2030. Right? So this is a huge increase in numbers, and by 2030, right, a large portion of the population is going to choose to not get married at all. So the last cause for a low birth rate would be a preference for smaller families. So culturally, people in that society will have a preference or a like for a smaller family. So again, why would this take place? People work long hours and they prefer not to have as many children because of other obligations. So the more hours you're working, you would rather spend that with your children. If you have more children, you might want to spend more of that time with your children. But as you begin to work longer hours in the office, then you might say, I don't want to have a large family because I don't have time to actually spend it with my children. Also, the cost, children are expensive, right? Think of all the things that you cost your parents. The cost of raising a child increases, right? And so people might choose to have fewer, right? Some families might even remain childless. So they get married, but they don't have children. But let's go back to the cost of raising a child. What goes into raising a child? You think about all the clothes you have to buy that the children need to wear and that have to be bought every year because they're growing. Think about the education. This is a huge cost, right? The toys, all the trips, extra costs for flights to take children on vacations and all these things. So by adding one or two children, right, to a family, you're going to increase that family's cost greatly. And you can see the average size of a Japanese family in this picture to the right. So the average size in Japan currently in around 2012 was 2.37 children. So on average, families have about 2.37 children. Now, there's something called a replacement rate. So the replacement rate is the number of children that a woman needs to have to make sure that the population is at least replacing itself, so that the people that are dying, right, are being replaced by the people that are having children, right, by children. So the number of children that each woman has to have to be at replacement rate is 2.1 children, or 2.1 births per woman. So each woman in the society generally has to have about 2.1 births, right? Some people might have 3 and some people might have 2 or less, so it all evens out, but this is, again, the average. So notice that Japan in 2012 was 2.37. The replacement rate is 2.1. So it's very, very close to that, just being able to replace the number of people, right? Now, interestingly, if you look up on statistics for the average size of the family, I'll tell you that China is 3.03. Now, I'll leave it to you to try and think about what it is that would mean, why does China, even though they have a one-child policy in China still, they're loosening it up, but it's still generally people can only have one child. But why would the average family size be 3.03? All right, so you can bring that answer to class. So we've looked at the causes of a low rate of population growth. Remember, those two things are a low death rate and a low birth rate. So now we need to go back and look at the population pyramid graphs for this low rate of population growth. Quick review, right? So remember that the population pyramid graph is a snapshot or a picture of what a population looks like at any given time. And then as we look at different years, then we can compare and how the population has changed. Remember that the x-axis is the number of people. A hashtag means number. Remember that. That's something good to remember. So number of people, that could be in a percentage, or it could be in a number of thousands of people per thousand people. Excuse me, number of thousand people. The y-axis, right, is age groups. So age groups or bands, they call them bands. So each band could be 4 or 5 years, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and on up, right? And then remember that it's divided in half, so the left side is usually male, right side is female, and then they can come in different shapes that will tell you different things. So let's look at our first population pyramid graph for Japan. Notice this is in 1950. So it gives you the population was 82 million people in 1950 in Japan. So let's look at some of the parts of the graph. Right? What should you notice first off? It looks like a Christmas tree. So the shape could be a Christmas tree. Or a triangle, right? But what is that? Why is it that? Because the base is very wide, right? So that means that there's lots of children. So there's a high birth rate, lots of children, means large base. Up at the top, right? Again, it becomes a point, a peak, right? But if you notice, people are still living fairly long up until about maybe 85 years old. So that's a pretty long life expectancy, but definitely not a lot of people are reaching that, right? So many people are living into a longer, older age, but not as many as possibly we will see later on, right? And then something else interesting is this dent right here, right? So notice that in 1950, these people generally are about 39 years old to, say, 20 years old. There seems to be this missing group of people, right? So take a second if you need to, pause and think about why would there be this dent or missing group of people. So, right, what the answer should possibly be is that these are the people that were fighting in World War II, right? So this is most of the males of war age. So these were the men that survived, but there should have been more, right? Many of the men were killed in the war, so you're missing a large proportion of men. And you can guess what some of that could mean for the other side, right? These women, although notice again there seems to be an indentation or a decrease in the number of women, but still a lot more. So a lot of these females might go unmarried. They might not have somebody to marry. So let's look at the next population pyramid graph. This is Japan in 1980. Notice the population has increased. 115 million people in Japan in 1980. Let's start possibly from the top down and look at some issues with the population in Japan at this point. So notice, again, the elderly, right? The elderly really starts at about this point. Much more people, right? So the peak of the pyramid is much fatter. So that means that more people are living into older age, are surviving into older age. So more people are living into older age and even extreme age, right? So you've got a lot of people living up until about into the 80s, 80 to 84, quite a few people, many more than in 1950. So a longer life expectancy. We've already seen that earlier. Let's look at the economically active, so the workers, right? Again, much fatter in this area. Notice again, here's that indent from the war. So those people that were war age have now moved up into their older age, into their 60s and 70s. So economically active has expanded as well. There are more workers. But let's look down at the base. What changes have happened down here? Big difference down here. Fewer births, fewer children. So are there fewer births, fewer children overall? Now, here's something interesting, right? Again, I don't necessarily know the answer to this, but it would be interesting to figure out. Both sides, male and female, so we know it's probably not a war if both sides are equal, but there seems to be something where 20 or 24 years ago to 24 years ago, people had dramatically fewer children. What could that be, right? Could be some of these people that were in the war or just coming out of the war, but for some reason, right, both male and female, right, at this point there was a dramatic reduction in the number of children that were born in that year. Now, notice what's happened later. Then it's gone back, and these people, right, these economically active people are having more children. We'll see what happens to these people later on. So the last population pyramid is Japan in 2015. So again, look at the population, 126 million people, right? Again, let's start from the top down. Now the peak, up top, the peak stopped at about 89, but now people are living up into their hundreds, and quite a few. So the peak is much fatter, meaning life expectancy has expanded again, increased. More people are living into these extreme ages of the 90-year-olds. So extreme life expectancies. We talked about Japan has the highest number of people over the age of 100, centenarians, right? This group of economically active has moved up again, and that group that was down there is now here. Again, notice this indentation. Again, this is that group that was 20 to 24 above right here in this major indentation. It's the same. So this is from 1980 to 2015 is 35 years on. So this is that same group that was above, and they've just moved up into this to the age band of 55 to 59, right? So that would be, again, interesting to figure out what exactly was it that made people have have fewer births in that year. But here's the interesting thing with this population pyramid graph is the bottom, right? So the bottom is a great decrease. It's a huge decrease in the number of births, right? So now we see that there are fewer children than economically active people above them, than the economically active people above them. So what kind of shape is this? Now we've got a cup, right? And a cup should look like this. Like a cup that you drink out of, right? So you have a larger proportion of the population at the top, smaller proportion of the population at the bottom. And that's basically what we have. Yes, of course, the elderly is a peak up here, but that's only because people are continuing to die. Not everybody can live into their 90s or 100s, so you're going to have this natural peak up at the top. But generally, from the economically active compared to below the children, these dependents below, it's much, much fewer children than above the economically active. And that's why we call this a cup shape. So, last thing are my references. You could go to these websites to look at some of the information that I used, or some of the references above. I include those on the sources.